In our previous video, we saw that there are two tests for intent. One is where the defendant desires to bring about a forbidden consequence, and the other is where the defendant knows to a substantial certainty that that forbidden consequence will follow from his or her conduct. Here we're continuing that discussion by looking at precisely what must be desired or known to a substantial certainty. This is known as the single versus dual intent problem. We're going to use the White versus Muniz case to examine this problem more closely, and it's one that comes up usually in battery cases. So in the White case, our defendant is an elderly 83-year-old woman with dementia who's in an assisted living facility, and while she's having her diapers changed, she winds up striking the employee in the jaw. Our employee turns out to be the plaintiff. After she gets struck in the jaw, she brings a battery action against this 83-year-old woman, contending that that was a harmful or offensive contact. So the issue in the case is whether or not this 83-year-old woman could have the intent to cause a battery. But even more precisely, the question is exactly what must the defendant desire or know to a substantial certainty? And there's two ways of framing this question. Either the defendant must desire or know that she's going to bring about both the contact and that it would be harmful and offensive, or she would need only to know or to desire that she would cause the contact and the contact would happen to turn out to be harmful or offensive. So the majority of jurisdictions have adopted what's called the dual intent requirement, which is the first way that I stated the issue. That is, in order for dual intent to be satisfied, the defendant must know both that his or her conduct would bring about a contact and that the contact would be harmful or offensive. A minority of jurisdictions say no, that only one of those things is required. Specifically, these jurisdictions say the defendant only has to desire or know that a contact will occur. The defendant does not have to desire or know that that contact will be harmful or offensive. Notice as the case reports, and this is repeated from our previous video, that the defendant does not have to intend to bring about the plaintiff's actual injury. So in this case, the trial court, after hearing various versions of the jury instructions, decides to adopt the dual intent instruction. And when that instruction is given to the jury enters a verdict for the defendant because the jury did not believe that this 83-year-old woman with dementia desired or knew to a substantial certainty both that she would cause a contact to the plaintiff and that that contact would be harmful or offensive. That decision was appealed to the Intermediate Appellate Court. That court instead adopts the single intent rule and says that our defendant here may have desired to bring about the contact, and it's irrelevant whether or not the defendant desired or knew to a substantial certainty that that contact would be harmful or offensive. And because the trial court gave the improper dual intent instruction, the Intermediate Appellate Court sends the case back, or wishes to send the case back for remand for a new trial. Well, this ultimately gets appealed to the Colorado Supreme Court, and really this case is not about the application of either rule to the facts. It's really more about a policy discussion. And you'll see these oftentimes where the rule of law is uncertain. So you should use this case to really get a handle on what are the policy differences between adopting the dual intent doctrine as opposed to the single intent doctrine. So the court does give a fairly brief discussion of these policies. Under the dual intent doctrine, it seems to be more fair that if the defendant not only desires or knows that he or she will contact, but knows that it's going to be harmful or offensive, then the defendant seems to have a culpable mental state. It would be fair to hold the defendant responsible. Notice this doesn't really provide any specific deterrence against that defendant because if the defendant makes a mistake and winds up contacting someone who turns out to be offended, the defendant would probably go ahead and commit that act. Notice also that dual intent is probably going to be very difficult to prove. And so that's one of the reasons why courts might have some skepticism here. Ultimately, the dual intent doctrine, because it requires the plaintiff to prove two things, would favor the defendant. The single intent rule provides deterrence because if you make a mistake and you wind up desiring to contact somebody, but you don't know if it would be harmful or offensive, you still might be held liable for an intentional tort. This is easier to prove, but ultimately it appears to be unfair because someone who really doesn't fully appreciate that their act will be harmful or offensive could still be held liable. This makes it easier for plaintiffs to recover, and so it favors the plaintiff. Ultimately, the Colorado Supreme Court goes with the dual intent doctrine. That was the same doctrine that had been adopted by the trial court, and so the Colorado Supreme Court just simply reinstates the verdict for the defendant because the jury had actually used what the Supreme Court says was the correct dual intent test for intent.